What's the most frightening thing that you have ever experienced in your life? I'm sure that you've experienced some pretty horrific stuff. A lot of us have. Some people have obviously had it much worse than others, but what if I told you that there was a man who experienced something so horrific that his story sounds more like science fiction than real life? Well, my friend, real life can sometimes be far stranger than fiction. The story that I want to tell you about today is one that you will probably find difficult to believe. In fact, even with all of the details, you may still think that what I'm about to tell you is a lie, and I would not blame you if you did. Sometimes it's better to avoid what may truly be out there than to face it head on, especially when that thing that you're hiding from isn't even from the same planet as you. Meet Travis Walton, a man who in 1975 would go on to experience something so horrific that it would scar his subconscious for life, cost him his public image, and follow him around until this very day. I'm getting ahead of myself though, so let's try to actually truly meet Travis so that we can better understand the man that he was, and then we'll try to get to understand the scarred man that he would eventually become. The year is 1975. Travis Walton is your typical 22-year-old tough guy lumberjack type from Heber, Arizona. His interests include riding motorcycles, fighting people in the boxing ring, fighting random bears in the streets, and cutting down trees. I did say he was a lumberjack after all. Travis was basically the equivalent of the guy on the front of the Brawny brand paper towels you see at the supermarket, except that Travis actually exists. He had a pretty good family life, and overall, he was just an average guy. At least for the time being. But that would all change. You see, Travis had a job that he was contracted to do clearing out old trees and brush from a forest, and the reason that he was tasked with this was so that they could prevent potential forest fires from happening in the Apache Site-Greaves National Forest. He worked with a crew of 6 other guys, and they would work as a team under the company named Timber Stand Improvement to clear out the woods and protect the forest. In a way, you could argue that the events to come were just as frightening for Travis's co-workers as they were for Travis himself. His co-workers' names were Mike Rogers, Travis's boss of 10 years, Alan Dallas, Ken Peterson, Dwayne Smith, John Gillette, and Steve Pierce. On November 5th of 1975, it was a relatively normal workday for the group. They were working as fast as they possibly could to try to complete their logging contract since the deadline was quickly approaching, and they were really rushing to try to clear this forest out as fast as possible. These guys weren't using heavy equipment for this either. The only equipment that these guys had were chainsaws, axes, and regular saws, so it was really down to their manpower to see through this contract's completion. Because of this, the 6 of them worked an extra long day this day, and eventually nighttime would roll around, and they were all still out in the woods working. The 6 of them, having finished with the area that they were working on, began loading up the equipment and putting it in the truck, getting ready to head out for the day. They began driving, but they really didn't get that far before they would notice an extremely bright light coming through the trees that they originally had mistaken for the moon. The men quickly realized, though, that this light could not possibly be the moon, because they were driving along and they could clearly see the moon in the night sky on the opposite side of them. So at this point, things are starting to get strange for the guys. The light itself was already very out of the ordinary. After all, it's really not normal to see any light in the middle of the woods at night, let alone a light so bright that you mistake it for the full moon. Unsure of what they were looking at, several ideas started to cross their minds, like maybe this light was a tent light or a campfire, but it was honestly just way too bright for that, so they kind of wrote that idea off. Then they considered maybe a plane crash, but they really had no idea what it was that they were actually looking at. They described this light as looking like a light shining through a lampshade, a yellowish glow that was just breaking through the trees, and they started to drive towards the light out of curiosity. As they approached it, they suddenly realized that they could hear this strange high-pitched alternating frequency that sounded kind of like a beeping sound of sorts. They hadn't even stopped the truck yet, and Travis, wanting to really go see what this thing is, decides to immediately throw open the truck door and jump out. He begins to run towards this mysterious light, and now that the men are closer and can actually get a better look at the light source, they're starting to realize that this light source is actually hovering about 25 feet up off the ground. All the men in the truck begin to yell, "Hey Travis, get back in the truck!" But Travis just ignores them. He keeps going, and as he did, he slowly begins to realize that what he was doing might not be such a great idea after all. He kept running towards the light, but he slows down a bit as he's getting closer, beginning to second guess his decision. Travis's curiosity, though, still got the better of him, and he continues to head to the light, ignoring his co-workers' pleas to get back in the truck. As Travis approached the object, he could make out more details of of it, and the beeping noise began to grow louder. And on top of the increase in volume, he started to be able to hear more subtle noises layered underneath of the original beeping frequency that they were all hearing. At this point, Travis and the other men realized that what they were actually looking at was this smooth, glowing, saucer-shaped craft with a dome on top of it. And it was about that time that Travis and the others came to the full realization of what it was that they were actually looking at. It was a huge golden flying saucer, a real-life alien spaceship. The saucer began to get even louder, and the men in the truck could hear the noise was picking up. Suddenly, the ground started to shake beneath them, and the truck began to vibrate, and Mike Rogers said that he could actually feel the shaking coming up through the steering wheel of the truck. The men were still pleading with Travis to get back to the truck, and with the increase in noise and a feeling of dread starting to set in for all of the guys in the truck, all of them were really starting to panic because Travis was out there with this thing. Travis crouched down, wanting to get a closer look at the craft, and trying not to be seen by the occupants, suddenly came to the realization of, hey, maybe I really shouldn't be this close to this thing. Travis tried to get up and run away, now positioned almost directly under the craft at this point, but unfortunately, he was too slow. When he stood up, a massive flash of this bluish-green light erupted out of the bottom of the craft, and this beam of what looked like electricity fired out of it. This beam of electricity would end up directly hitting Travis right in the chest. His co-workers were in shock as they watched Travis's body light up with what looked like electricity. This electricity knocked him off of his feet and into the air, and they watched as Travis's body came back down to earth, almost lifeless looking, and bounced around like a rag doll. The men just sat there in shock for a moment, thinking, oh my god, our friend is dead. When they came to their senses, though, they began to drive off in a panic, but really didn't get that far before that panic subsided, at least a little bit, and feelings of guilt for leaving Travis behind began to wash over them. They got about a couple miles away from where it all happened before they stopped and got out of the truck. Mike, not only being Travis's boss, but also his best friend for the last 10 years or so, began to argue with the others about going back to get Travis, feeling guilty for having left him behind. The men were initially worried that they had been maybe being followed by this unknown object they had just seen in the woods, so they were not very keen to go back and look for Travis out of their own safety. But they did realize that they probably should at least go get help. They had agreed to go and attempt to contact a group of hunters that they had saw earlier that day, hoping that maybe having some guns along might be of some assistance. They go back to the truck and they begin to head back to the hunter's location. They made it about a half a mile before deciding, maybe we don't need to go get the hunters. We got a truck bed full of chainsaws. We could try to do some Texas Chainsaw Massacre stuff if these aliens start a fight. Let's go ahead and just head straight back to the site and look for Travis. So that's exactly what the men did. They skipped out on the hunters and decided to head back to the site. So they get to the site and start searching for Travis. But then they come to the realization that both the UFO and Travis are now both literally nowhere to be found. The site's empty. The men, now realizing Travis is gone, really started to panic. Mike Rogers actually fell to his knees and broke down in tears, both happy that Travis was gone, giving him some hope that maybe Travis managed to crawl off somewhere and could still be alive, but also fear that maybe whatever this craft was may have taken my best friend somewhere and I'm never gonna see him again. After this, they immediately head to the local police station to report Travis missing. And the whole time, all any of them can think is, oh god, they're gonna think we killed Travis, man. No one is ever gonna believe this ridiculous story that a UFO killed our coworker in the middle of the woods. In a way, they were literally watching their own lives flash before their eyes because now they were all scared that they'd be spending the rest of their lives in a federal prison. They thought that there was absolutely no way that the police would ever believe the story of a UFO murdering our coworker and that we're just screwed. Like, we're going to prison, there's no ifs, ands, or buts, we're done for. But still, feeling that they need to do the right thing, they go to the station anyway and tell a deputy what happened, and the deputy immediately began to look for signs of drugs or intoxication, which he failed to find any. Not sure what to do, the deputy calls his superiors and gets the local sheriff to come and deal with the situation. The sheriff gets there, and upon arriving, he does the exact same thing. He searches for signs of drugs and alcohol, he doesn't find any, and then he decides to tell 3 of the guys that, hey, you guys wait here in town, You other 3, you're coming with me back to the site so we can search for Travis. So they head back to the site of Travis's disappearance with the sheriff. And at this point, the sheriff really was not buying any of the UFO claims, as you probably guessed, and immediately assumed that these guys had murdered Travis Walton and hid the body. The assumption was that some sort of altercation must have happened between Travis and the men, and this likely must have led to a murder by chainsaw, and that his body is probably in pieces buried out in the woods somewhere. So almost immediately, the police begin to search for the now officially missing Travis Walton, and the 6 men were split up into different search groups with different officers, each being interrogated by these officers individually while they searched for Travis. They were asking the men repeatedly, hey, where did you hide Travis's body? And all sorts of questions of that nature. The men all stuck to their stories though, as you might expect, and this search ended up turning up nothing. At one point during the search, the sheriff actually had to ask for a Geiger counter to be brought down, almost starting to somewhat maybe sort of believe this UFO nonsense, but not really, but just wanting to be on the safe side that, hey, maybe if it did happen, maybe this area is radioactive. Let's just check it for the sake of checking it so we cover all our bases. So that's exactly what they do. They take the Geiger counter, the police start searching around the area with the Geiger counter of where Travis disappeared, and it turns out that the area was radioactive to the point that the Geiger counter's readings were literally maxed out. It was unsafe levels of radiation. A couple of days into the search, men in black suits began to show up from undisclosed parts of the federal government, and they began investigating as well. Not only were these men searching the area, but also following around the men who saw the UFO take Travis away. Somehow these guys knew exactly where every member of the work crew was going and would show up before the work crew even got there. And it was pretty obvious these guys were from the government because of the cars they were driving. They were black cars, government plates, that sort of thing. So it was pretty obvious that these guys were from the government. And to this day, it's unknown which part of the federal government these men answered to. However, it's pretty safe to assume that they were likely from some secret branch of the federal government that was investigating this UFO incident, along with other UFO incidents at the time. Knowing what we know now, it's probably pretty safe to assume that these guys were likely the equivalent of what we now know today as the UAP Task Force, or maybe even Air Force OSI, or at least some similar agency to this. This isn't exactly rare in these sorts of cases, as men in black were widely reported when following up with UFO cases, so the government must have felt that this case had some sort of merit, or at least was interesting enough that they should send government goons to investigate. The search continued, and a few days into the search, the police made the 6 men submit to lie detector tests in an attempt to prove that they actually had killed Travis Walton. All of them spent an entire day in the Navajo County Courthouse taking these tests, and eventually they all did pass. Although one of them did have to be retested. That was Alan Dallas. He had been in run-ins with the police before this, and he felt very uncomfortable while taking the test. They were all asked 3 waves of questions. In the first 2 rounds of questions on the test, Alan had actually managed to pass before freaking out and freeing himself from the testing equipment. The reason he freaked out is because he was really under the assumption that he was about to be thrown in prison for murder, and he already hated the cops, so that didn't help anything. Eventually, though, he did sit back down and redo the test, and he actually did pass the retake. The test itself measures stress levels, though, so stressful memories, like the ones that they had all just experienced, could actually mess with the test and make them out to be lying even if they weren't. Polygraphs are known today to not be that accurate, and because of stuff like this, a lot of false positives and negatives can be had. The true accuracy is somewhere between like 50 and 70%. So in reality, you're basically just, you could pretty much flip a coin and get the same results. And this is why we no longer allow them as evidence in court proceedings. However, the examiner was the most qualified in the entire state, and the examiner and many other experts agreed that if these 6 men were all lying, there was literally a 1 in a million chance. And I mean that, like, you could go and buy a lottery ticket and be more likely to win. Not a Powerball ticket, but like a scratch-off maybe. And the odds of winning that scratch-off ticket are higher than the chances apparently of these 6 men all passing a lie detector test like they did. I don't know how accurate that is. As I mentioned, it's probability based more than actual science, but that's what was stated. So take this information how you will. At this point, though, the results were given to the local sheriff, and he had no idea what to think, because back then, lie detector tests were seen to be much more accurate than we know them to be today. They had been searching the entire forest, looking for signs of a body and piles of brush, and a massive force with all of the stops was brought out to search for Travis, but they had found nothing. But you may be wondering, do we actually know what happened to Travis? Well, you see, Travis actually didn't die after getting struck by that lightning bolt. His co-workers had assumed wrong. Travis would eventually wake up on a table with his vision blurry, not sure what was going on. When he regained his vision, he realized that there was some sort of a large metal device with lights on it, almost like a box with wires sitting on his chest. He thought that maybe he was in the hospital, and then he thought he saw 3 men that he assumed were doctors standing over top of him. But once his vision finally settled in, he could see that these 3 doctors were actually 3 large-headed creatures with gray skin and black eyes. These supposed doctors were actually what we know today as gray aliens. Coming to this realization, Travis immediately sits up in a panic and starts to freak out. He throws the device off his chest, pushes one of the aliens that are closest to him as hard as he can, sending this alien flying back, and in the process of doing so, realizing that these beings hardly weigh anything, and then in a panic he begins to look for anything that he can use as a weapon. Eventually, he grabs something off a table of what he assumed were medical devices. It was some sort of a glass tube-like device. He breaks the end off of it and starts swinging it around at the aliens wildly like he's in some kind of a bar fight. All Travis can think is, God, I just need these things to back off. I need to get out of here. I don't know where I am. I don't know what's going on. I gotta go. And the beings seemed like they were still going to try and come over to Travis despite his wild flailing of whatever this device he picked up was. But they did eventually seem to come to the realization that if they got too close to Travis, Travis really was going to hurt them. So I guess they decided that, maybe this isn't worth it. So they all just gestured like, what the hell, man? And they all just turn around and leave the room, making a left out of the room. Travis, now realizing that these beings are gone, decides to follow them, but he doesn't want to run into them again. So he makes sure to go right, the opposite direction that these beings went, just to avoid any possible chances that there, could be a rerun-in with them. Travis gets out into the hallway, makes the right as I mentioned, but he starts noticing something. He kind of can't breathe. The air where he is extremely thin. So he desperately begins to look for a door handle, and he sees these flat walls, but they look like they should be doors. Like there's parts of the wall that look like they should be able to be opened, but the doors aren't reacting to Travis, if these were doors at all. At this point, Travis is just desperately looking for a door handle so he could open one of these doors, but the walls in these doors were all just super smooth metal. There was nothing to grab. All he could do was feel around. He's struggling for oxygen at this point, and in his mind, all he could think of is, I gotta get out of here or I'm gonna die. He's thinking, look, if I could just find a door. This thing was only like 25 feet off the ground when I saw it. So maybe I could just jump out, make that jump, just go to the ground, and if I break my legs or something, fine, but at least I get away from whatever these creatures are. However, Travis would fail to find a door, but eventually Travis did come across this room with a chair in it and a big panoramic glass view out of the craft that he initially thought was some type of an observatory. Outside of the craft, Travis saw what looked like distant stars and planets. Not knowing what to do, just knowing that he had to get back to Earth, he decides to sit down in this chair and begins to mess with these weird colorful lights that are on the arm of the chair, and he just assumed that these were some type of buttons. In his mind, he's thinking, maybe if I press the right one of these doors will open. That didn't happen though. Instead, these stars outside of the craft began to move. They all just began to rotate, and Travis thinks this was accidentally because he had found the ship's controls, and having no idea what he was doing, just began button mashing like a child playing a video game for the first time in his life. Suddenly, a figure began to appear in the doorway, and when it actually got into the doorway, the shadow gets cast over Travis and it grabs his attention. Travis turns around and realizes that this figure wasn't one of the aliens, it was a human. He gets a good look at it, and this man that's dressed like an astronaut, literally wearing an astronaut helmet, the whole suit, all of that stuff. Travis sees this and he's just ecstatic. He's thinking, oh man, the government must have sent somebody to save me. This guy's a human. And he runs up to this unknown person and just starts pleading with him. Please, man, you gotta get me out of here. You gotta save me. I don't know where I am. I need to get back to Earth. Travis is now at this point just ecstatic to at least see another human being after having just fought off 3 great aliens. He can't help but think, man, this guy's gonna save me. He's gonna get me off this ship. I'm gonna go with him. NASA must have sent this guy, or the Air Force. He's here to intervene in my abduction and take me back to Earth. This is my ticket to freedom. So Travis starts begging the guy to take him out of here. Let's go. The guy, as I mentioned, doesn't say anything. He just stands there with this expressionless face and a creepy grin occasionally. And then, out of nowhere, with Travis not thinking anything of the weird behavior, just grabs Travis by the arm. And as Travis is trying to talk to him, Travis thinks, well, maybe this guy is just, ignoring me because he can't hear me. So I'm not going to bother. Let's just, I'm just going to go with him. Why not? I have no other options here. So Travis, he just doesn't fight. He just gets dragged along by this guy like this guy's leading a stray puppy somewhere. And eventually they get to one of those smooth looking door things I mentioned earlier, which, guess what? It was a door. And that door opens without the man doing anything. He doesn't press any buttons. He doesn't open a door handle. The door just opens. But when Travis walked in front of the door earlier, the door didn't react at all. So clearly it's not a pressure sensor, so there must be some other mechanism that makes this door open. But that's not important because they go through the door and they get to this room because the rest of the ship was very dimly lit. So when they get to this room, Travis notices that the light here is a lot brighter than the rest of the ship, and it's coming in from beyond the door. Then he feels this cool air, this breeze, rush over him, and suddenly the door behind them closes and Travis can breathe way easier now. He's actually able to breathe normally. Travis also noticed that in front of them was another door-looking thing, so he waits with this man, and he's trying to talk to this man still. The guy's not saying anything. Travis is eventually just decided, this guy can't hear me. I'm gonna stop trying. And they pretty much just stood there after a moment in silence, and this lasted for about 2 minutes before the door in front of them opened, and then they exited down this ramp. And when they got down the ramp, Travis realized that there were a bunch of these other flying saucer things just scattered about inside of this weird hangar. And at this point, Travis doesn't know if they're inside of another much bigger ship or if this is a hangar somewhere. He has no idea where they're at. And he's still not thinking it's weird because he's thinking that, well, we're off the ship. Maybe he's taking me to the escape area. Maybe we're going to get out of here still. So he's not fighting yet or anything along those lines. He's just going with this guy. The man continues to lead Travis until they eventually get to another room after they've basically traversed through the entire hangar. And when they get there, there's a male and female human, and neither of them are wearing helmets. So Travis is thinking, oh, these guys must also be from the government too. They must be here to help as well. But then he realizes that they're standing around an examination table, and then Travis slowly begins to freak out again. Because these men and women start to force Travis down onto this table, and Travis is fighting with all of his might. He can't do anything though because these creatures or beings, humans, whatever they are, have superhuman strength. And it's, Travis thought he was pretty strong. He's a young, tough guy. He works in the woods all day for a living. He fights. The guy's tough, but he can't do anything against these three. They force him down on the table, and the woman takes this oxygen mask looking thing that's not connected to any hose or anything like that and puts it on Travis's face. And the next thing Travis knows, everything just went black. The next thing Travis knew, he was laying on the ground outside of a town, and he eventually realized that this town was actually Heber, Arizona. And when he looked up, he saw above him the light of the ship shining down on him, and then he watches this craft just shoot off up into space almost instantaneously. Travis then drags himself up off the ground, now feeling extremely weak, and realizing where he was, he makes his way over to a phone booth nearby and he calls his brother-in-law Grant. Grant initially thinks that this is somebody playing a prank on him because everyone had assumed that Travis was dead at this point. It had been 5 days and 6 hours since Travis's disappearance. And on the phone, Travis has to plead with him, "No, Grant, please don't hang up. This really is Travis. I need you to come and get me." And eventually Grant did realize that, hey, this is Travis. This isn't a joke. And he immediately has to get up, hop in his car, and go to the phone booth where Travis was. And he said that when he got there, Grant found an emaciated Travis Walton. Travis, not realizing why Grant seemed so emotional, only thought that he was gone for a couple of hours. That was until Grant told him that, man, you've been missing for 5 days, and everybody has been worried sick looking for you. Travis didn't believe him at all at first until Grant said, man, Travis, feel your face, dude. So Travis does, and he reaches down, he rubs his chin, he's silent for a moment, and realizes that he has a 5-day growth of beard. At this point, Travis realizes what's actually happened, and he breaks down in tears. He really cannot believe what just happened to him. Grant has to hold him like a baby while Travis breaks down in his arms. And they end up taking Travis back to the house, and they try to keep his return quiet at first. They want it to be a secret. They don't want anybody to know that Travis is back because Travis is very clearly traumatized. Travis's family ends up contacting a group called APRO, or APRO, a science-based UFO investigation organization who secretly decides to send Travis to a hotel in Phoenix, Arizona. He checks in there under a fake name, and they have Travis undergo a series of medical tests. In these tests, they found no trauma to Travis's head, no drugs in his system, and that Travis had lost 12 pounds, but somehow he had no ketones in his bloodstream. Ketones are what your body emits in your blood when it begins to eat its own fat and muscle to survive. Somehow Travis had lost this absurd amount of weight in only 5 days. He was severely dehydrated, but was still nourished enough by these beings that his body didn't begin to destroy itself. It was almost as if these beings knew enough about human biology to at least attempt to keep Travis alive. Shortly after, a phone operator that had heard of Travis Walton's missing person report had been listening in to a call that was placed through to Travis. Realizing that he was still alive, she decides to report it to the local police. Right after this, the police and reporters, now having caught wind of Travis's return, despite Travis being in complete shock from the whole situation and trying to lay low until he readjusted, immediately come down on him and his entire family. The police really want to know what the hell happened. They want to get Travis to come in for questioning immediately and to take a polygraph exam. And even worse than the police, the reporters, man, they are desperate to get an interview with Travis. Some having even come from far off countries like Japan just to try and learn about Travis's account and what happened to him. The crew, they were relieved. And the family was overjoyed that Travis was back, but they really did not appreciate all of this extra media attention that they were now getting. Travis would eventually undergo a polygraph test though for the National Enquirer, the first of which the tester claimed that he thought Travis had been deceiving the test by holding his breath. Travis had argued that he was still stressed out from the situation and struggled to talk about it without having a stress response. But Travis was eventually retested and he did pass a polygraph. Again though, this is exactly why you cannot put much stock into polygraph tests, as the results are essentially meaningless whether it comes to proving or disproving anything. However, there is more evidence that does help validate Travis Walton's claims, and we will cover that here in a bit. But first, I want to shed some light on the detractors of Travis's claims, mainly one man named Philip Klass. You see, Philip Klass was under the theory that Mike Rogers and Travis Walton had conspired with the logging crew to make up a story. He theorized that they came up with this as a hoax in order to get out of the logging contract that I had mentioned earlier. This theory really doesn't make a whole lot of sense though, because they had already completed over 80% of the job and money from the contract was being held back until its completion. If anything, it hardly makes any sense that they would try to use this story to get out of the contract, because then they would never get paid. It isn't like there was some sort of magical UFO clause embedded in the contract that would nullify it and get them out of it, and even if there was, they still wouldn't even get paid for all the work they did. And let's be real, that really doesn't make sense, because they would have basically been doing a very large part of this contract for free in that situation. And then there was an attempt from Philip Klass to allegedly offer the youngest of the group $10,000 to say that the event was a hoax, which he didn't take despite desperately needing that money. And remember, this is $1975. In today's money, that's about $60,000. And people have speculated that the way that Klaus even got this money was because he was connected to a government agency, and that this agency likely gave him the money to try to get this story debunked and out of the papers. And this claim really isn't even that outlandish when you consider that there are confirmed groups from the government that were indeed throughout history sent out to spread disinformation and silent stories like these. Air Force OSI, which Richard Doty was a part of, comes to mind as one example, and Project Blue Book being probably probably the absolute best example. But that's a story for another time though. If you want a detailed video on Project Blue Book and the adventures of J. Allen Hynek, then feel free to leave a comment letting me know and I'll make that happen at some point. But as far as Philip Klass goes, he probably never actually did debunk any of the claims. In fact, I think we could say with almost certainty he didn't, because you can't provably debunk this stuff. There's just no way to prove or debunk it, really. Well, there is more evidence for proving it than debunking it, but I guess you can't actually know it happened without having witnessed it yourself. But rather, Klaus just threw around a multitude of theories for why they would make this up, and it really wasn't unique to this case either for Klaus. He did this to every UFO case that he could get his hands on. So when it comes to Philip Klass's opinions, I really don't take his theories very seriously. Now, about the evidence I mentioned earlier, in 2014, Travis and a man named Ben Hansen went back to the site to search for evidence of Travis's abduction. And as you likely already guessed, considering how much time had passed, they weren't sure that there would still be any remaining there. To their surprise, though, they did find two compelling pieces of evidence at the site. The first being the rings on the trees that were in the immediate vicinity of the clearing where Travis was abducted. The ones that had been chopped down recently, the rings on the trees were all distorted. You see, rings on trees normally grow in a perfect circle pattern, but these rings were actually growing in a circle, but then like coming out towards the direction and like pointing basically to where Travis was abducted. And on top of that, the growth of the normal tree canopy as a whole was much more drastic near the abduction site and normalized to regular levels the further you got away from the abduction site. The second thing they found there were higher concentrations of magnetic materials in the soil samples from the site versus their normal control samples from areas surrounding the site in the rest of the forest. As I mentioned earlier in the story, the ground was vibrating, and it's theorized that the reason for this is because the energy the craft was emitting may have been heavily magnetized and pulled magnetic metals such as iron up from the lower levels of the soil and up to the Earth's surface, all of which cannot be found in areas surrounding the clearing where the abduction allegedly occurred, only in the clearing itself. Finally, though, to leave you guys off with something to really chew on, I want to draw attention to an interesting Facebook post made by Mike Rogers, Travis's boss, as well as his main abduction witness from the event, and this was made in 2021. Mike had posted an image saying, and I quote, "I, Michael H. Rogers, being of sound and rational mind, do hereby give notice that I am no longer to be considered a witness to Travis C. Walton's supposed abduction event of November 5th, 1975. When Mike Rogers was questioned by people about this on Facebook, asking if this means that he's saying the event never happened or if he simply just doesn't want to be associated with it anymore, he said, and I quote, "I want nothing more to do with Big T," referring to Travis specifically. The event most definitely happened, from our perspective anyway. I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that, but then in response to another post that said, in quote, "It is unfortunate that after all these years you have chosen to say the abduction never happened," Rogers replied with, and I quote, "I am not saying it didn't happen. We witnesses all took polygraph tests, remember? All I said is supposed, like in yippee, maybe. All I mean by supposed is like still steaming pasture pie, maybe. So maybe the abduction did happen, and maybe it didn't, and maybe it's still a steaming pile of manure." Then in a reply to the same post, Rogers said, and I quote, "Travis tried to keep a new remake of the movie a secret from me. He has always had his big secrets that he's kept from me, and it angered me. I tried over the last 2 weeks to reason with Big T, but to no avail. I don't believe Travis is an honest person, and therefore I want nothing to do with him." End of quote. Another member of the crew, Steve Pierce, also once said, end quote, "Travis is the most ignorant, stupid person that I've ever met in my life. He ain't got enough sense, to write the book he wrote. There ain't no way he could have wrote that book by himself. He ain't got enough common sense to write that book." Pierce also said that he never liked Travis, so in a way, not calling the event a hoax may in some way actually lend to the event's credibility, as he was actually there as a witness. And if he really hates Travis that much, he could just throw Travis under the bus and call it a hoax. But later on, Mike Rogers would go on to publicly apologize for what he said, again on Facebook. And I want to apologize for not including the post from Facebook. I'm actually banned on Facebook, so yeah, I don't have them. But I do have a couple images. So those I will share with you. In the apology, though, he wrote, "I, Michael H. Rogers, make an open apology to Travis C. Walton for anything negative I may have said against him within the last few years." It's also good to remember that Travis is also married to Mike Rogers' sister, so there could have been some family drama behind all of this. Travis would also go on to publicly apologize to Mike, saying, "I, Travis Walton, apologize to Mike Rogers, and any others who may have been offended by the exchange, for negative things that I have said about him during the last few years." Mike Rogers would then go on to say that, "I always was Travis Walton's main witness. How could I not be? I was just trying to get his undivided attention, and it worked." So guys, do with that information what you will. I'll let you guys decide down in the comments if you think this event truly happened, or if this is all just, as Mike Rogers said, a steaming pile of pasture pie manure. That's all I have for you guys for this video, though. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to tap the subscribe button and notification bell before you go. Or, if you have more time to kill, maybe consider checking out this other video that should be popping up somewhere on the screen right about now. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys again in the next one. Peace.